I think we're good. If we could just have people take their seats. We're about to get started. Oh my God. Amazing. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Ryerson University and welcome to the White Privilege Conference opening session. My name is Jen Gonzalez. I'll be your MC for this evening. When I'm not MCing in the evening, I am the Director of Student Life here at Ryerson, and it's a great honor to be with all of you this evening. Thank you. Fans in the house, thank you. That's so nice. Before we start the night, let's begin with Ryerson's acknowledgement of the land. This land acknowledgement has been adopted by Ryerson University and our Aboriginal Education Council. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations, peoples, and Europeans and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Before we go on with our programming, there are a few housekeeping items to share. In case of a fire alarm, please leave the building through the nearest exit. You will find the red signs. Washrooms are on the first floor. Outside the doors, you will find all gendered washrooms on my right, your left. This is a sign of a really good MC. Your left side are where the all gendered washrooms are, and there are gendered washrooms on your left side. If you're hungry later or throughout the conference the next few days, please take advantage of the restaurants in the neighborhood. They're my favorite places. On the back of your badge, you will find some neighboring restaurants who have generously given some discounts to you if you bring your badge in, so please enjoy those spaces. Please visit the info booth outside these doors for any further questions that you have. We have a whole slew of amazing volunteers who are happy to have you here and will answer any questions you might have. Please make sure you visit the marketplace, which is definitely on my agenda in the next few days, on the third floor of this building, featuring a diverse array of exhibitors and vendors from the community. And you can also purchase speaker books with a 20% discount, again, with your badge. Your badge is going to be very important. Another note with your badge, 20% off trade books, clothing, and gifts at our university bookstore, which is at the corner of Gould and Victoria. You can't miss it, so go on in and get your Ryerson swag. And there's also an announcement sheet in your program with Wi-Fi information and workshop changes. So hopefully you'll have all the information you need, and if you need anything at all, any of the volunteers will be happy to help. Lastly, we want to know how you're experiencing WPC Toronto and global. There's lots of conversations that are going to happen, and you can share your thoughts and stories on social media using the hashtags, hashtag WPC Ryerson and or hashtag WPC Global Toronto. This event is happening because of the careful planning of the Office of the Vice President, Equity and Community Inclusion. Please help me welcome someone whose leadership and advocacy have helped to shape Ryerson's reputation for excellence in equity, diversity, and inclusion, one of my sheroes, Vice President Dr. Denise O'Neill-Green.
I just want to exhale right now. You might imagine why I feel like doing that. So good evening and welcome to the White Privilege Conference Global Toronto. That's your cue. So after much time, preparation, thinking and planning, many sleepless nights, excitement, anticipation, and expectation, we're finally here. We've been planning WPC Global Toronto since last fall. I first heard about WPC several years ago from Ryerson colleagues who had experienced it in a way that was quite transformative. That's probably when the seed was planted. But several years later, after taking on the role of Vice President, Equity and Community Inclusion, WPC came to my attention yet again from one of our keynote speakers, Ritu Bhasin, and some of you might have attended her session earlier today. She expressed that the founder, Dr. Eddie Moore, was looking to bring WPC to Canada. Her description of the conference, enthusiasm, inspirational words took hold of my imagination, and I started to think, what if? So we set out to create brave spaces for conversation, to explore the theme, are Canadians too polite? And people told me that over and over when I got here from the US. Are Canadians too polite? So it didn't come from me. It came from interacting with Canadians, addressing global perspectives on white privilege and oppression in Canada and beyond. We knew the focus of the conference would channel how we as Canadians view ourselves in terms of inclusion being that mosaic, but inclusion requires disruption and questioning of the status quo in a thoughtful and engaging way. So that said, it's absolutely wonderful to have everyone here to engage in this conversation in their own way to make Ryerson, Toronto, and our community a more inclusive place. So besides launching the conference, this has been an exciting year for my office and my team. This month, we're marking the celebration of year one of an office and 1 full year as the Vice President for Equity and Community Inclusion at Ryerson. We're proud to mark our anniversary with bringing something new, challenging, and brave for us to discuss. And as you know, we all experience some form of privilege, regardless of our race, gender, class, or whatever other status in society. Our goal with this conference is to enhance our understanding of privilege and how they intersect by examining and challenging those concepts and concepts of oppression. We're even privileged just by virtue of being here at Ryerson this evening. And I'm especially excited to have our keynote speaker, Dr. Walcott, here with us this evening to kick off the conference. And we're absolutely very pleased to have a lineup of dynamic speakers, including Dr. Shirley Chichu, Chancellor of Brock University, who will be here tomorrow morning, Desmond Cole, who I'm sure many of you know, and we snuck in an American there, Dr. John Powell, Executive Director and Chancellor's Chair of the Haas Institute. So just in closing, because I know we want to get to our speaker, I just want to give a very heartfelt thank you to all of you for being brave, taking on this conversation, being here this evening, participating in the conference for the next 3 days. And I want to especially thank our president, Mohammed Lashmi, for supporting our vision, and even more importantly, the Ryerson community for partnering with us to make WPC Global Toronto a reality. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Denise. We owe a lot of success to this conference to many of our generous sponsors, one of them being the Faculty of Community Services right here at Ryerson. I know there's a bunch of people right in the front that like to be here from the Faculty of Community Services. So on behalf of the Faculty of Community Services, please help me welcome their Dean, Dr. Lisa Barnoff, to say a few words and introduce our keynote speaker.
Hi, everyone. As Jen said, I'm Lisa. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Community Services at Ryerson, and obviously much shorter than every other person who has been at this podium. The Faculty of Community Services is home to 9 schools, including Child and Youth Care, the Daphne Cockwell School of Nursing, Disability Studies, Early Childhood Studies, the Midwifery Education Program, Occupational and Public Health, Nutrition, Social Work, and Urban and Regional Planning. We're called the Faculty of Community Services because our work is all about community impact. Our 9 schools share a focus on working in service to community with the goal of enabling positive change as such change is identified, of course, by community. I'm so pleased to be here tonight at the opening of the White Privilege Conference and to have the honor of introducing our keynote speaker, Dr. Rinaldo Walcott. This conference and the dialogues that it will foster over the next few days are vital. And while this conference is happening within the confines of a university, engaging with and resisting white privilege and white supremacy, as opposed to some people's beliefs, one of which was published in the Toronto Star, this is absolutely not an academic exercise. The power relations that enable the continuance of white privilege and white supremacy have real material impacts affecting people's everyday lived experiences. And resistance to the relations of power that maintain white supremacy are quite literally matters of life and death. I'm hopeful that this conference will have very transformative outcomes. There is so much work for us to do. If this conference encourages more people to recognize the urgent need for action to confront and resist white privilege and white supremacy, while also furthering opportunities for support, solidarity, and community building for those already very deeply engaged in doing this work, then this conference will have been a tremendous, tremendous success. Because I believe in the possibilities that this conference can create, when Dr. Denise O'Neill Green approached me to ask if the Faculty of Community Services would be interested in being a conference sponsor, I was immediately intrigued. I went immediately to the conference website and I saw that Dr. Rinaldo Walcott was to be a keynote speaker. I immediately wrote back to Dr. Green to say I would like to sponsor his keynote in particular, because I knew, regardless of what else might take place over these few days, without a doubt, I could stand behind this particular keynote 100%. Dr. Walcott is a fierce, seemingly fearless, brilliant scholar. He works continually to confront, challenge, and resist white supremacy. Because he's such a strong activist, and because of his public profile, he often becomes a target of racist hate. Tonight, by placing him as the very first keynote of the very first white privilege conference in Canada, this conference honors him and his lifetime of work. Personally, I wanted to be part of this, and I wanted the Faculty of Community Services to be solidly associated with this too. And I now have the privilege of introducing you to tonight's keynote speaker. Dr. Walcott is Director of the Women and Gender Studies Institute at the University of Toronto, Associate Professor at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, and a member of the graduate program in Cinema Studies at the Faculty of Arts and Science at the University of Toronto. As an interdisciplinary scholar, Dr. Walcott has published on music, literature, film, theater, and policy, among other topics. All of his scholarship is founded in a philosophical orientation that is ultimately concerned with the ways in which coloniality shapes human relations across social and cultural time. His teaching and research is in the area of Black diaspora cultural studies and post-colonial studies, with an emphasis on questions of sexuality, gender, nation, citizenship, and multiculturalism. Dr. Walcott received his PhD from OISE at the University of Toronto in 1996. From 2002 to 2007, he held the Canada Research Chair of Social Justice and Cultural Studies, where his research was funded by SSHRC, the Canadian Foundation for Innovation, and the Ontario Innovation Fund. No, that's wrong, Ontario Innovation Trust. In 2010, Dr. Walcott was appointed as a Senior Research Fellow at the Warfield Center for African American Studies and the Department of African Diaspora and African Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Before joining the faculty at OISE, he was Associate Professor in the Division of Humanities at York University. And while at York, he served as the Graduate Program Director of Interdisciplinary Studies. Dr. Walcott is the author of Black Like Who, Writing Black Canada. He is also the editor of Rude, Contemporary Black Canadian Cultural Criticism. As well, he is a co-editor with Roy Moodley of Counseling Across and Beyond Cultures, exploring the work of Clement von Tress in clinical practice, and co-editor with Dina Georges and Catherine McKittrick, No Language is Neutral, Essays on Dion Brand, Intopia, the Journal of Canadian Cultural Studies. Most recently, Dr. Walcott published Queer Returns, Essays on Multiculturalism, Diaspora, and Black Studies. Currently, he is engaged in completing his next book project, The Long Emancipation, Moving Toward Freedom. As an interdisciplinary scholar of Black studies, Dr. Walcott has published in a wide range of venues. His articles have appeared in academic journals and books, as well as popular venues such as newspapers and magazines. He's often called upon to comment on Black cultural life for radio and television. We are so fortunate to have the opportunity to hear from him tonight, and he will also be presenting as part of the conference tomorrow. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rinaldo Walcott.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by thanking the White Privilege Conference for inviting me to participate in this conversation, in particular its founder, Eddie Moore. I'd like to thank my colleagues at Ryerson, Vice President of Equity and Community Inclusion, Dr. Denise O'Neill-Green, and I'd like to thank Dean Lisa Barnoff for that lovely and generous introduction. I know I'm about to fail it. And I also like to thank Darrell Bowden and Angelo Robb, who really kind of made it possible for me to get here and to do this work. And I thank all of you for coming. So my talk tonight is called White Lies, Race, Power, and the Future. We are living at the juncture of a significant historical moment. From the white supremacists in the US White House, to the assertion that colonialism was good for the colonized, to neo-Nazis marching in the streets of Europe, the US, Canada, to legislative wins of extreme right parties across Europe. Whiteness as a structure of authority, power, and violence has reasserted itself in our present time. The measure of this moment depends on where we will turn. Will we turn towards truth and ethics, or will we turn towards a retrenchment of our horrible past? Should we turn towards truth and ethics, it would mean that we are seriously ready to tackle the conditions and the terms under which we might come to live differently together in the present and the future. However, to achieve such a desire and to make it an actuality, we will have to come to terms with the lies that presently structure our current social relations and sociality. The lies I refer to are a set of ideas that are promulgated concerning the evolved nature of our society, in which contemporary individual and personal life is cut off from the dreadful collective past that has produced it in the first instance, and we must therefore not reference that past as still animating our collective present. Some scholars have called this white innocence, but I prefer to call it lies. Lies for me mean that the force of these ideas is such that one cannot escape them. One must go through them to potentially arrive at a different place. But I also call them lies because even our more important ideas for producing a different kind of world finds those ideas having to somehow be compromised in the context of the routinized and enforced idea that the terrible past is behind us now. In essence, we must lie to our collective selves to even get the conversation going. But more specifically, white people must collectively lie to themselves that the current organization of human life is arranged to give us all access to what I will shorthandedly call the good life. The whiteness that I refer to here is multiple. First, it is the people that we have come to call white people, and it clearly relies on phenotype. But more importantly, whiteness is also a structure, And by this, I mean a set of logics, ideas, practices that work to reproduce white people as superior to others, and therefore as benefiting from a society built to confer and confirm that superiority. Secondly, by whiteness, I mean to signal a structural feeling in which those marked as white share in and benefit from the conditions that produce societal advantages for white people. Additionally, those not marked as white are positioned as aspirants to it. Those aspirants I call, following Frank B. Wilderson III, junior partners in white supremacy and white superiority. The important thing to note is that whiteness as a structure keeps in place a post-Columbus global compact in which not white people are generally and ideologically positioned as less than in a crude and rank order of beings. The institutional organization and arrangements of contemporary human life are presently in crisis everywhere. And here in Canada, the crisis manifests itself in a number of different ways. Chief among those ways is who belongs, who counts as Canadian, and how might the network of institutions, both public and private, that organize our collective lives and govern and administer our social relations, come to represent our collective interests in ways that all of our lives might be fulfilled. Since Canada is a settler colonial state, an outcome of the post-Columbus world, Canada fundamentally understands itself as a white nation state, derived of the Europeanness that is also understood to be white. The ideas that hold such a claim together are replicated, reinforced, and perpetually propagated by the governing, administering, and ruling institutions of the state. These institutions enforce a monocultural political and cultural order that is Eurocentric in both nature and practice. In the execution and maintenance of this Eurocentrism, we are asked to accept the lie that European Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment understandings and interpretations of and impositions of a particular way of experiencing the world and living it is the only way to do so. Canada as a nation state is foundationally built on that logic. However, that logic has continually come under duress. It has been consistently contested. Resistance by indigenous people, black peoples, and other not white and some white ethnic minorities have often forced Canada to revise its Eurocentrism. But the nation state has never fully abandoned it. It is the revisions, often felt to be progressive, as ushering in change, that become the platform for other kinds of lies that keeps the Eurocentric white supremacy firmly in place in Canada. So the first lie, the multicultural lie. The most significant post-World War II lie is the multicultural compact. This is a significant lie because it asks us to collectively confirm a set of ideas that refuse to be translated into everyday life for many, even though we repeatedly insist that these ideas represent what Canada is and how we might actually live. From the inception of multiculturalism as policy, not white Canadians have criticized its inadequacies and its performance as policy that might stem racism and other forms of discriminatory practices. Indeed, in the now more than 40 years of official multicultural policy, not white Canadians and black Canadians specifically have lived under conditions of racism that have been relatively unchanged since post-World War II and might be said to have intensified from the 1990s to the present. Nonetheless, Canada is understood as having produced a multicultural society, one that is settled around living with racial and cultural difference that is supposed to be enviable around the world. However, the lives of black and indigenous peoples are the counter to the national lie that multiculturalism is a successful policy for organizing Canadian life. One might argue that multiculturalism works to confirm the white founding mythology of Canada, but does not undo that founding's execution of its white supremacist logics. Nonetheless, multiculturalism as both a policy and an idea remains tethered to Canada as a way to think about the scene of the nation state. While I call multiculturalism a lie because it continually keeps in place the idea that Canada is a white nation with all the other not white others constituting its colored adjunct citizenry, to accept that multiculturalism is success policy of citizenry organization and administration is to accept the lie that whiteness in Canada has decentered itself. We know collectively that the latter is not the case. The lie of multiculturalism then functions to produce a compact where certain kinds of diversity can be celebrated as standing in for collective representation. To accede to those kinds of representational practices is to agree, or at least become complicit with the lie. Just this past Sunday, when an article about this conference appeared in the Toronto Star, I received a number of emails. The one I'm about to quote from reinforces the idea about the vaunted Canadian diversity as animating our Canadian lives. The person writes, "I'm appalled with the white privilege conference you are promoting. Our Prime Minister tells us diversity is our strength, and you want to cause," they say diversity, but I think they meant to say division, "and you want to cause diversity in Canada." This was ill-thought out and divisive. I believe any federal funding you receive should be removed from the university until such time you decide that all Canadians are deserving of equal treatment. The conference advertisement made me ashamed to be a Canadian, and it made me ashamed to have served my country in the Army for 39 years. You still have time to determine if Canada is inclusive, or if you believe Prime Minister Trudeau lied to you too. Yours in disgust. I quote this email just so that you can see it. I quote this email because it embodies so much of the rhetoric and mythology of not just Canada, but of the strategies of whiteness. The invoking of time in the Army, the destroying of our diversity, the assertion of all Canadians as deserving of equal treatment, the accusation of causing division, and most of all, the writer's insistence on asking if PM Trudeau lied to me, to us, about diversity as a strength. The word lie in the email jumped out at me for a number of reasons, in part because a letter like this one is asking that I or we conform to the national lie that Canada is a place where racial difference and inequality is a settled question, thus suggesting that white advantage is not an issue. The letter is a perfect recitation of the mythology of raceless and racism-free Canada. It is, in short, a lie, and the lie that we are required to accept as a part of a compact in which race and therefore racism disappears from our conversations, even if it's still animating our lives. So on November 4th, 2015, Justin Trudeau announced what was quickly hailed as the most diverse Canadian cabinet ever. As quickly as the claim of most diverse was uttered, it was also criticized. When asked about his diverse cabinet, in particular his gender parity, PM Trudeau quipped, "Because it is 2015. On both social media and in the mainstream media, a debate about what constitutes diversity and furthermore representation emerged, pointing to the limits of gender parity as diversity when race and ethnicity enters the frame. The debate delimited the phenotypic features of PM Trudeau's cabinet, pointing to Indigenous women, South Asian and Middle Eastern MPs as a way to get beyond the limit of gender parity as diversity. Glaringly absent from the phenotypic cohort was Black MPs. It is at this point that we might find it important to note that the language of people of color and diversity is what I would call an obscure language. By this I mean the logics of POC and diversity lack specificity, and therefore can continue to do the work of whiteness. The invocation of diversity is meant to suggest that the work of race equity is being done and that representation is being worked for. But such assumptions can obscure exactly who is being included and represented, as was so clear with PM Trudeau's cabinet's composition at that moment. In this instance, the structure of whiteness fashioned its subordinates in hierarchical order. Presently, we have been making more robust calls for diversity and representation. The very people who have benefited from the long and terrible history of racial advantage are now telling us that they will usher in this new remedy. But instead, the long discredited language of unconscious bias and its claims has been returned to us as the way forward in a range of governing institutions. In particular at my university, unconscious bias is the rage. What the language of unconscious bias does is that it refuses to acknowledge how the structure of institutions reproduce particular practices and ways of being. And furthermore, it seeks to not place any one particular person as responsible for the perpetuation of those practices of advantage making. The French philosopher Etienne Balibar wrote of racism without race. Unconscious bias does not make a similar move. It attends to practices and behaviors without attending to institutional arrangements. In this instance, it is more like racism without racists. This slip is crucial for maintaining the white supremacist arrangement of our institutions without having to account for how they're enforced, their reproduction, and how those inside of them are responsible and benefit from that reproduction. Indeed, in an effort to not offend white people, we have gone so far to talk about racism as structural to the extent that people go missing from the structures. So to be clear, white people are the face of white supremacy and they benefit from it. We cannot avoid making that claim simply clear. One of the ways in which we are now told that the structures which appear to be magically operating on their own can reform themselves is if we indigenize them and if we decolonize them. These two ideas, appropriated from more radical calls for total transformations of how humans presently live, are now being deployed to interrupt the radical political movements of indigenous resurgence and the movement for Black lives. Why or how is it possible that the very people who have systematically benefited from the advantage of those institutions will indigenize and decolonize them now? If multicultural policy saved the nation state as the potential libertarian movements of the 60s and 70s erupted, then we are in a similar moment now. Indigenizing and decolonizing is being harnessed and redeployed to preserve the structure of whiteness with a few adjustments and revisions. Indeed, if radical thinkers found multiculturalism in its logic of diversity wanting, diversity too has returned as the most robust term now used to winnow out the radical politics and potentialities of indigenizing and decolonizing. Calls for diversity dressed up in indigenizing and colonizing rhetoric fail to adequately account for whiteness as a structuring device of our institutional and everyday lives. Diversity rhetoric obscures the function of whiteness to accrue to itself the terrain of change. That is what must change. That is what must change, how it must change, at what speed it must change, and so on. It is the common sense of diversity, that is, the simple evidence of difference that makes diversity so appealing. But such simpleness, in this instance, does not do justice to what radical calls for indigenizing and decolonizing actually ask of us. The hard truth of the matter is that the governing and administrative apparatus of whiteness is prepared to appropriate any discourse, any politics, any ideas, and any ideals that retain the post-Columbus Compact, a compact where Europe and its derivative nations and their peoples, now marked as white, continue to be given privileged status across the globe. To maintain such status, nation-states like Canada produce themselves and appropriate ideas like indigenizing and decolonizing, while keeping in place all the institutions that flow from the initial and ongoing colonial context. To claim that we can indigenize or decolonize without taking on the social, cultural, political, and economic arrangements of whiteness is to enter the terrain of lies. Such claims of indigenizing and decolonizing in that fashion is coterminous with the logic of putting history behind us. Such claims leave intact institutions not built for us, never meaning to receive us as in the ongoing regiment of our society. In essence, then, such appropriations work to keep white supremacy intact, even if understated. The language of race has often worked to make whiteness invisible. The idea of race and its biological determinism has been central to the apparatus that took shape to produce whiteness as an advantage. The advantage of whiteness then cannot be divorced from the logics of white supremacy and white superiority. The idea of white privilege is but one component of white superiority and white supremacist logics, and their institutionalization of whiteness as the standard to be attained. Once the biology of race has been discounted, another network of logics come into place to continue the advantage of whiteness without race, which is the Balabar idea. Culture becomes it, crime becomes it, immigration becomes it, poverty, and so on. The now well understood that race is a social construction does not mean that racism no longer exists. In fact, it's the idea that race no longer exists that often fuels the logics of white supremacy today. In this way, many use the non-existence of biological race to insist that those who are disadvantaged by lacking access to whiteness are creatures of their own making. This logic underpins the structure of whiteness and its resulting practices as the status quo, and thus privileges whiteness's ongoing authority to shape our collective world by a singular benefit in favor of those who can't access its structure. To hold whiteness at bay to a certain degree, we have developed a network of sub-institutions like human rights offices and tribunals, diversity offices and officers, equity offices and officers, and so on. These offices and officers are accompanied by languages like colorblindness, equity, diversity, social justice, post-racial, and so on. I see in all of this an apparatus invented to do important work and keep whiteness satisfied that its legitimacy is not under attack. The paradox that we find ourselves in is one in which, to descend to whiteness and produce a different kind of world, we find ourselves working to pacify whiteness so that other potentialities might emerge. It is the totality of white hegemony that the transformative logics of decolonization are meant to disrupt, break, and produce something new. The regime of race relations management, as Adolph Reed Jr. once calls it, sets in place a process of articulating a set of changes that seem to never occur. To respond to this change and seem to put Amiri Baraka in a different context, to invert Baraka here, is to open up the lie at the heart of the race relations apparatus and regime that works to keep the structure of whiteness intact and in authority. Indeed, in today's culture, we are told that telling the truth about the historical constitution of whiteness and the ways it has ordered the world is responsible for the re-emergence of white fascists, nationalists, and white liberal resentment all at the same time. We are told that to seek social justice is to demonize white people. We are told that we must embrace our individualism and take responsibility for our own exclusion, if it can even be called that, exclusion. We are told that the very identities that white supremacist logics have given to us should now be put behind us. In short, we are asked to perpetuate more lies in the service of sparing whiteness a serious and sustained look at itself. The inability to fully engage whiteness in the structure of violences that sustains its functioning and existence is the central problem of our moment. So while race is a non-starter, racism remains a central organizing feature of human life, and its principal function is to place whiteness in a position of authority and power continually. To refuse current arrangements of human life is to situate oneself in a position of calling for a different value to be accorded human life. If at present human life is valued in relation and proximity to whiteness, then to expose the violent structure of whiteness as a regime of value advantage is to enter into a confrontation with the deepest logics of our society. Whiteness as a structure then even shapes how, in our attempts to overthrow it, we continue to coddle it and its creations with the kinds of languages and offices that I earlier mentioned. What is worth noting here is that radical politics and radical political imaginaries are generously concerned with the preservation of collective personhood. And so in some ways, the generosity of a radical politics has often created more than enough space for whiteness to come into itself as a betrayal of itself, and yet it never does. That's a really interesting paradox for radical politics. So to draw heavily on the work of, and I won't bore you with lots of quotes from them, but this is who's influencing what I'm thinking here right now. To draw heavily on the work of Adolph Reed Jr., Lyndon Barrett, and Sarah Laura James, we can make sense of how the potential libertarian moments of the 1960s have been interrupted by a retrenchment of whiteness. Using their work, I mark the mid-60s as a time when the potential overthrow of whiteness seemed possible. The social movements of the 60s, in their short-sightedness, I think, failed to rethink value as foundational to post-Columbus orders of life. And so those social movements were easily incorporated into the existing logics and structures of white supremacist patriarchal capitalism, to use the language of bell hooks. Significantly, when we look at such benefits, the benefits that derive out of those movements of the mid-60s, what we see most clearly is that the extension of those benefits, what the extension of those benefits did, and this is following Adolph Reed Jr. argument, was to demobilize more radical calls for transformation. So what Adolph Reed Jr. argues is that the interruption of a more radical politics to decenter whiteness got turned into a logic of inclusion and diversity, and therefore was demobilized. I just lost my thing. Okay, so such gestures of inclusion rather than structural destruction are currently the means whereby late modern capitalism divorces its most cogent critics without an apparent lack of indigestion, as William Havel once puts it. It is precisely for this reason that the value of inclusion, in the many senses and the way that value may be invoked, especially in monetary and racial logics, requires a rigorous re-engagement, and not one dependent on white pacification to achieve its goals. Indeed, my argument is premised on the idea that value is always already linked to capital and its racial economy, rather than ideas about human worth. That is, rather than value is often not linked to ideas about human worth, which I believe have come to be the foundations of anti-racism, social justice, equity discourse, and so on. So you hear a lot of talk about diversity as an economic good, right? not diversity as human worth. And so thus leaving the structure of whiteness in place to endow what counts as value still. One might suggest that where those mid-60s movements stalled was in their inability to think and put into place, in their own movements, a politics of value that could matter and that could extend beyond their own incorporation into capitalist patriarchy. And understanding the value that could reside outside of late modern capitalist logics that was immune to the seductive pull of inclusion and the performative rhetoric of representation of bodies, identities, and communities as we work to make it actual in all of our lives. The late Lyndon Barrett, writing with the contested theorizations of value, asserted, and he wrote, "To interpose no alternative value in the theoretical neutral moment of calling value into question remains equivalent to strengthening and reincarnating reified dominant value." Barrett was getting at the ways in which our failure to think critically and rethink value helped to reproduce the very logics of white supremacy that we often imagine that we're working against. That the social movements of the mid-60s, in their broadest sense, did not rethink value, that means that the promise of a different order of planetary life was immediately compromised, and the conditions for incorporation made possible, and therefore manageable in the already existing order and structure of white authority and its administrative apparatus was able to proceed. The existing conditions therefore become adaptable to include without substantive change. As a pessimistic aside, let me be clear that the benefits won by those movements are not meaningless, but rather we must now come to see those benefits for what they are, one at the expense of deepening an already deadly culture. The problem of reorienting value is an important one for any future that seeks to produce a world in which value exists beyond the orbit of the current financialization of life in the service of white authority. C.R.R. James in 1939, anticipating such a moment, articulated what he called a Negro movement that would participate in the larger possible anti-capitalist revolution, but with its own and probably very different outcomes. James made his comments in relation to the Communist Party's failure to both recruit and to adequately address Negro American problems. James was in part offering a critique of whiteness and its structural logics. His analysis pointed to the ways in which various black movements had embedded in them the ability to sacrifice for what he called the promise of a new society that the Communist Party failed to recognize. Indeed, what James articulated is a different notion of justice than the Communist Party could either hear or tolerate in that moment. His utterances act like a cautionary tale for us today, but in a reverse way. What are the ways in which our current apparatus for transformation might work to produce white self-sacrifice for the promise of a new society? At the moment, the answer to this question remains unclear. Thus enters anti-white racism as a response to an already compromised set of articulations that have yet to produce sustained and deeply meaningful change. And here I read you another email. I'm completely disgusted by your racism against Caucasians. Canadians are walking up en masse to this revolting New World Order agenda to socially engineer hate and division via propaganda and brainwashing. European Caucasians built Canada. European descended Canadian Caucasians were key players in the Underground Railroad that saved blacks from slavery. Canadian Caucasians have welcomed tens of thousands of new immigrants of every race, color, and creed. Your conference is a direct and unprovoked attack on Caucasian Canadians who are known for multicultural tolerance. This is clearly an effort to manufacture and spread social tension and hatred in Canada. Shame on you. White rage is not just words, it is also bodily constituted. Ideas live and emanate from the body, and the articulation of white rage resides in white bodies too. The idea of race as biology might be behind us, but the language of race remains firmly with us. European Caucasians, Canadian Caucasians, and the resulting logics of save blacks from slavery and multicultural tolerance have enfolded in them race as a lingua franca of white consciousness. It is a consciousness to stake. It's a consciousness to stake authority, to render correction and appropriable, and to dictate the terms under which conversations about the potential justice and readjustments of human life might proceed. Such utterances are not merely outbursts of fringe elements, but such utterances reveal the grammar of race thinking, raciology, and the structure of rightness as an authority and authorizing force of human life. It is the banality of such utterances for whiteness and white people. It is the banality of such, I messed up my sentence here. It's the banality of such utterances for white people and whiteness that such claims can be made. If race as biology is behind us, what is most definitely not behind us is the way in which whiteness and power structures our social relations and sociality. The two emails that I cited in this talk are examples of the work of power. Both of those emails were directed to a list of recipients or authorities with an appeal to action. In this case, sanctions be enacted. The emails were sent to the Prime Minister, to the President here, to Dr. Green, they just list everybody. Local MPs, on and on. The emails are an appeal to power, but the emails also are an exercise in power, one in which whiteness seeks to draw to itself the power to punish and discipline those who refuse to inhabit the lie. Central to the structure of whiteness that I have been detailing here is a sense of power, the power to decide and to authorize that which it terms to be legitimate. Indeed, when whiteness's legitimacy is questioned, its most violent forms emerge. The claim of anti-white racism is thus one moment in which the questioning of whiteness seeks to respond to the challenge of its hegemony by usurping the language of legitimate response to racism to shift the critique. We must refuse the idea of anti-white racism because it seeks to severely deform our conversations in a fashion as to produce a stalemate in which actual potential change becomes impossible. The truth is that white people clinging to whiteness and its ideological apparatus is as bad for them as it is for the rest of us. Their inability to betray whiteness as a structure of knowing, as a regimen of encountering the world, as a measure of what it means to be human, and as an arrangement for the terms in and on which we govern our collective selves remains a danger for all of us. If post-Columbus Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment ideas and ideals got us here, we are now in need of new ideas and new ideals. First, I want to stress that I too believe that modernity, as it has been idealized, remains an unfinished project. And by this I mean that many of us who are not white remain the excess baggage of a modernist project that simply cannot contend with our humanity and repeatedly understands it as less than or not existing at all. But I don't think that modernist ideals are enough. So many of those ideas have been imagined in particular against Black life that they need something more robust than a revision. Indeed, I'm interested in witnessing in my lifetime white people and whiteness abdicating its lofty place atop the human scale. That is, the disappearance of the scale altogether. We ignore the scale's existence to our own collective peril. The current articulation of anti-white racism is a blunt refusal of the potential to transform. And yet the politics of transformation has consistently been built on both the possibility and the desired reality that white people and whiteness can transform. In fact, many of our political compromises for a different world have been premised on such assumptions. White people will have to risk something here. They will have to risk that we won't do to them what they have done to us and continue to do to us. The measure of a possible future begins at the moment of the betrayal of whiteness, both in its bodily comportment and in its authority to know, narrate, administer, and thus command the terms of social relations and sociality. The idea of race traitor, long articulated by some of the earliest whiteness scholars, might be understood as an ethical incitement to experience whiteness differently, to forego its wages in service of another way of being in the world. The difficult truth is that white supremacy offers us no new vision of the world other than a continuation of the horrors we have already endured, and thus is a setup for our continued asymmetrical antagonisms. Over the last years, I have been attempting to think through what I have come to call a pure decolonial project. Because I do not think that we can continue to invent new languages for marking disenfranchisement and its eventual remedy, nor is it politically desirable, I hold on to the promise of a decolonial future, a future yet to come. In this moment, we must wrestle with what that future might look like. We must risk putting flesh on its imagined bones. Radical politics has never been conceived with a notion that white people are incapable of transformation, as I said before. It has always understood its desires for another world as a collective endeavor. And in so doing, that has meant that the kind of radical politics I'm imagining here has a central role for people now marked as white to play. A pure decolonial project seriously requires us to consciously push collectively into the not yet known, because the now known is so deeply unsatisfactory, to put it that way, and anti-human. And most of all, a pure decolonial project and its potential future requires us all to give up on our current project of the human, our project premise that dictated and enforced on a partial and incomplete idea of what the human might be. And that begins, and a pure decolonial project then begins with a collective refusal of the structure of whiteness as a mode of being human, as a mode of being human at all, because of its fundamental insufficiency for what a life might actually be. Thank you. I forgot to get to the last slide.
Questions or no questions? No questions.
Okay, cool.
I have a gift for you, so I'm going to ask you to stay up here. Okay. Thank you so much, Rinaldo. We have a gift for you. This is for you. I think you just set quite the foundation for a decolonial project for the next few days for us to think about and talk about with each other. And the disappearance of the scale is something that I'm deeply invested in as well. So thank you very much for setting the tone for the rest of the conference. Thank you. All right, a few other housekeeping things. I think we have a jacket that was lost. So we are going to try and get that back to the owner of that person. Where is it? There it is. Are these anyone's? Perfect. Oh, awesome. Okay, perfect. Let's get that back to your mom. Perfect. It's up here. Thank you, Tony. Thank you all for coming this evening. We hope that you enjoyed the beginning of the conference. We hope to see you tomorrow for the official opening day of the White Privilege Conference Global Toronto. You'll have the opportunity to meet our president, Lashemi, who has been a deep supporter of this project. We will also have a keynote by Shirley Chichu, Chancellor of Brock University, and Dr. Adrian Wing, Associate Dean for International and Comparative Law Programs and the Bessie Dutton Murray Professor at the University of Iowa College of Law. And while this conference is a place for us to talk and hear thought leaders inspire us, this is also a chance for you to take art in. So tonight, right in this room, there will be a series of films showing immediately after we're done at 7:30. So we encourage you to stay if you're interested. And room details for the rest of the conference are in your program. Thank you again, and have a wonderful evening, everyone.